second episode of our webinars. It's our two webinars per week, every Monday and Thursday. My name is Barry Kassab, and I'm in market development for MCA. MCA stands for Musicians and Consumer Audio. So today is our second webinar, and we will start talking about the Shure microphones from the inside out. And today's webinar is going to be dedicated to talking about polar patterns. But before we talk about polar patterns, we'd like to talk about the history about Shure microphones and their involvement and how they affected the polar patterns in the history of the microphones. Last week, we talked briefly about how the polar patterns or how Shure generally was involved in making the history of microphones, and how microphones previously, before Shure was involved, was something that would have been custom manufactured or should have manufactured for a certain purpose. It was not commercially available yet. And then slowly, by the time Shure started to put its fingerprint into the industry, the microphones took the commercial shape that we know about today. Just by mentioning a word microphone, the first thing you think about is, a handheld microphone of any kind. So the way that it started is like back into the telephone era, when Thomas Edison and Graham Bell were together working away to transport an electrical signal over the wires. I have a presentation to share, and before I kick through the presentation, I'd like to just give you a note that if you experience any bandwidth issues, as in you feel that the flow is a bit slow, or the voice is not getting well, or the audio is not getting well, switch to a low bandwidth on your receiver or on your computer or in your phone, in which you can actually get all of the information that you want to look at. So starting with our first slide here, it's going to talk about the agenda for today. So the structure will be very simple. Of course, this module that I'm doing today and this presentation usually is done in a live situation. And when I say live, as in person. So don't take things in particular, but I'm using the same presentation. So generally, the first module is going to talk about Shure and the modern microphone. So how is Shure involved with the modern microphone? We'll have another episode talking about dynamic microphones and condenser microphones in details. So this is part of the module, but we're not going to talk about it today. And then we're going to have a microphone operating principles, as in exactly how the dynamic microphone works from the heart of it onwards. And of course, there's a dedicated webinar for that. Today's webinar is going to talk about the first module, with also covering the polar patterns. Now, the reason why I've chosen this is that, in my opinion, as an engineer, that this is the most misconcepted topic about microphones. People, when they choose microphones, when they look at the polar pattern, this is something they don't really take in consideration. The only thing they think about, it feels like it's an option. It's the same way when you look at automobile, a car with, a cruise control. Yeah, it is there. I know how to use it because I use it. But what about other things related to cruise control or other things related to other options in the car? A lot of people don't even know these options. And from the time they buy the car until they sell the car, maybe they never even use it. So until you know about these, you start to look at them with a different angle, and you go like, for this purpose, I need to use a super cardioid. Or for this purpose, I need to use an omnidirectional microphone, and so on and so forth. Before I kick into the next slide as well, I'd like to welcome on board one of the very renowned engineers. His name is Fali Demenia, a very good colleague of mine, and also he brings a lot of the experience from the live environment and studio environment to kind of complement everything we have today in our webinar. It's impossible to get everything on your head. I know something, somebody else knows something else, but all together we can bring all the knowledge on one platform. Moving forward, Um, so the course objectives here today is to first, we need to understand the role that Shure plays in the history of the microphones. And then we talk about a general microphone operating principle that will happen later. The polar patterns, that's something we're going to talk about them in detail today. And of course, under the hood, there's stuff that you also learn about down the line, which is the pneumatic shock mounts. What is a shock mount? Uh, is it like a shock absorber or something like this? Of course, it is a kind of that, but we'll talk about them in details. And then how Shure microphone designs and testing separate those microphones apart from everything else. And then we need to talk about the latest innovations that Shure had done in microphones in the past few years. So today, the most important part, which will be the history and the polar patterns. So let's talk about the history at the beginning. I'm sorry, the slides is getting a bit late on my screen. So if I look on my left, that means I'm looking on the actual slide. So I'm not getting distracted. So the beginning of microphones, it started with Robert Hooke, who experimented with the string stretch or attached to two cups. Everybody did that when they were young. So you put the first cup on your ear, your colleague, your friend puts the other one on his mouth, and he talks through, and you hear some of the sound passing through this. So that was the first part where he experimented with medium. And when I say medium, as in how does the sound pass through? I mean, does it need something to run on it? Just like cars, can it run in the air? No, it needs a road or a paved road to some extent. Some cars can do off-roading, okay, but a normal car needs a decent kind of road to run on it. Audio as well, or sound, needs a medium. So the more dense the medium is, the faster the sound travels. So if you remember in the Wild West, when they want to know if, another person is coming from abroad where they cannot see them, they put the ears on the tracks, on the rail tracks. And because the rail tracks are made of iron, and the speed of sound in the iron is actually about 2,000 meters per second, while in the air it's 340 meters per second. So that means because the iron is more dense than the air, the sound travels faster. So they are able actually to hear sounds that coming from areas that they cannot even see, which is the same to how Robert Hooke was experimented with the wire. Afterwards, David Hughes and Thomas Edison developed the carbon microphone. The carbon microphone is something most of us lived, or at least experienced once in their lifetime. Some of them actually lived it for a good, decent amount of time. Most of the telephones up to, you can say, 96, 97, year 96, 97, they were made of carbon composite microphones. Carbon composite microphones is very basic design. You have a stretch diaphragm, a container with some carbon powder, and two conductors. The diaphragm is stretched on that container. When the carbon composite or the carbon powder vibrates, it changes the resistance, which is corresponding to the sound. Now, of course, David Hughes, Thomas Edison, they were the first to do that kind of experiment. Now, they refined the carbon composite microphone in 1886. The refining of the microphone was in terms of bandwidth. Now, what is a bandwidth? Bandwidth is the ability to accommodate a wider frequency range. So when I talk, for example, about monochrome TVs, if anybody remember those, or you've seen pictures, or you've seen a picture in black and white. So a black and white has just a very narrow band or a very narrow frequency response, which only corresponds to two colors, black and white. Shades of black mixed with shades of whites gives you that range. Now, does it look good? It's okay. Is it a high quality? Definitely not. The resolution is only related to the lens, but the colors is something we call frequency response. Now, in the world of microphones, the same thing was there. The monochrome version of microphones, or the black and white version of microphones, are the microphones that were used in telephones for the longest ever. It gives a very narrow frequency response. That means it gives you only from 400 hertz up to 3.5 to 4 kilohertz, depends on the operator. Now, carbon composite microphones themselves, regardless of the operator, as in the phone line operator, they give you probably down to 200 hertz, but nothing above 4 kilohertz. Reason simply is that the carbon particles, they can oscillate, or they can create that motion inside up to a certain frequency, and then it stops. And that is the main reason why the bandwidth of the carbon composite microphone is very limited. Now, when they refine the carbon composite microphones, they kind of extend the frequency response slightly bigger by two things. Number one, putting a bigger container and a larger diaphragm. Now, why did they use that? It's simply for orchestras. So now we're doing a live stream. You can see me, you can hear me, and we're not even physically in the same space. So back in the days, the requirement for something like this was there for people to attend operas that is happening in another town. That traveling to these towns would take forever, probably 2 to 3 days. And it doesn't make sense to travel over, a cart or, a pair of horses or mules to some other town to attend a concert and come back again. Even if they could afford it, it's very risky. So Thomas Edison refined the carbon composite microphone to accommodate that purpose and that purpose only. So it was like a big tissue box size. They were placed on stage, and the size of the diaphragm was able to respond to lower frequencies, probably down to 90 to 100 hertz. And they were sending the signal over telephone wires, which rich people would pay in advance, like a pay per listen, if you want to call it, PPL, and they would listen to the performance. Now, still, you can see it's a very special purpose microphone here. But the first practical moving coil microphone was built in 1923. So there was nothing before that as in a practical moving coil microphone. Now, what is a moving coil microphone? It's simply a wounded coil stretched on a diaphragm moving in a magnetic field, just like any speaker. If you see any speaker driver, a speaker driver has that dome which covers the coil from the dust, and behind the coil, everybody have seen a magnet behind the speaker. A lot of us played with it when we were young. That is a magnetic field. And Faraday's law in electromagnetics, it's very simple. Any conductor moving in a magnetic field would generate electricity. Any electric current moving into a conductor in a magnetic field would create magnetism, or without a magnetic field. But I mean, the magnetic field is just used to detect it. And that's why we get the noise or the hum from, electricity around us, because the wires in the wall are emitting electromagnetic waves that can affect other devices in the room. Now, the first microphone in history built for the commercial use was built by Shure in the 1930s. A lot of us know it as the 55, which is or the Fat Boy, the Super 55. And it kind of looks like that microphone here. I'll try to bring it closer to the camera. A lot of us remember that microphone. That was a reversioning of that microphone, which was the 55S. But the early builds of the moving coil microphones were with the Super 55. The microphone was, the grill of the microphone was coming from the famous Oldsmobile. Also, it's the I got an article, I think 2 days ago, I think it's in 1938, that actually had the most impact in the latest builds, but the early ones was in the early 30s. I think it's a 31. So the founder of the company, Sidney Shure, had an Oldsmobile that he loved so much, and he loved the front grille, and he kind of made the same shape from the front of that grille. Now, moving forward here, let's switch to the next slide. The most important part about that first microphone, which is the Model 55, is the slogan attached to it. So before that, all the microphones were omnidirectional. Now, what does omnidirectional mean? Omnidirectional means that you cannot aim a microphone to you to prefer or to choose a sound source over the other. So nowadays, when I want to hold a microphone, I simply hold the microphone and I aim it to me, just like this microphone is aimed to me, or if this one was connected, it has to be aimed to me this way. But in some of the movies, you find the microphone put this way. Do you think it's going to work? No, because this is not the favorable side of the microphone. This is not where the pattern of the microphone is working, and this is what we're going to cover today in details. So that means in order to make the microphone work for me and pick up my sound, it has to be aimed to me. And with this, that was the birth of the first polar pattern in history, which was called the Cardioid. Sorry, I just got a call on the phone. So with this, you can see that the Cardioid polar pattern itself was born by the time Shure invented the first unidirectional microphone, and that was called Unidyne 1, or just Unidyne, and that was in the late 30s, like in 1939. And the slogan, as you can see in the screen, it says goodbye feedback. Very simple. I mean, today it doesn't mean anything. I mean, obviously you don't want to have feedback in the microphone. But back in the days, feedback was something you cannot avoid, because the microphone, as I can say, it cannot be directed. So if I have the PA system towards the people and I'm holding the microphone still be able to pick up the sound from the PA system, regardless of the orientation. Now, I'm going to do a quick test with this microphone. And I'm going to let you hear how does an omnidirectional correspond regardless of the direction. So now this microphone is in action. Probably if I hold it regardless, like this way, it still works. This way, it still works. And I think you're still able to hear me anyway. So you can see I can even hold the microphone wherever I want and it will still work. And I can see actually my level is kind of popping in. It's of course not as loud as a directional microphone, but if I gain it up by pushing a bit more gain here, so maybe now it's kind of, yeah, I can see that now it's much better. So regardless of the direction, I can see even the level on my mixer down there, it still works. 1, 2, check, 1, 2, check, 1, 2, check, 1, 2, check. It's still the same. So this is what we call the omnidirectional, and in most of the times you find it with a circle. Let's see if that has something here. No, but if you check online, any microphone with an omnidirectional, it will have a circle, and that circle usually corresponds to how the microphone is sensitive. That means all of that lines are sensitive lines. Anytime the line quenches somewhere, that means it's getting less sensitive. And if you look at the drawing here in the screen, in the black part, you can see the heart, and that's where the cardioid name came from cardio. So that point at the top, that is where the least sensitive part of the microphone is. A very famous microphone that everybody uses is the SM58. So try to plug it in. So checking now the mic. So now I'm aiming it to the front. This way you can hear me properly. I can see my level on the mixer. Just need to get it up a bit. Sorry. Okay, here we go. So it picks up from the front, slightly from the sides as well. But when I aim it backwards, probably nothing. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. So you can see it completely rejects the sound from the back. So it seems I'm not getting audio. Let me just check. Check 1 2. Check 1 2. Are we getting audio? Fally?
Yeah, Barry, we're getting audio.
Okay. So moving forward to the next slide. This is a kind of a quick drawing of how the microphone was built and how many components are in the microphone. This is like the earliest one. It was designed by Ben Bauer. He's a very bright engineer from Poland who moved to the US at the early days. And he was the first to actually come up with the idea of a unidirectional microphone. And these are different models as well of the microphone that was also using the same components, which was used in auditoriums, in schools, in house of worship, some presidential kits as well. They all contain the same unidirectional microphones, or what we call them today as the Cardioid. Some articles as well that was showing how the microphone stopped feedback or aimed in way more or less feedback, because now I can aim it away from the source, which means I'm not causing the source to come back into my microphone and cause that pinging sound or the feedback sound. So the unidirectional microphone had a long phase of modifications that went through. And one of the major modifications on the microphone was changing the polar pattern. And the reason why the change in the polar pattern happens is that because also the music became more complicated. So in the early days, there was not a big amount of musicians on stage, or the music was actually picked up from the background. People can hear it in an orchestra, but then they were starting to get leaks into the microphone. So the mic started to pick up some of the bands in addition to the vocalist. And the update to that one was a new polar pattern, which was just switch to that slide. Of course, before I go into the other pattern, there was a 55S, which is that one here. The 55S is just a smaller version of the Super 55, the earlier version, the bigger one, just because TV broadcast started. And because TV broadcast started, the microphone was quite big and it will cover pretty much half of the face. So there's nothing left from the artist anymore. So what they needed to do is actually kind of make the mic a bit smaller, in which when you have the TV cameras shooting the artist, it will not cover his face. So that was the 55S, or what they call it, the 55 small. Then after that, they thought about a different polar pattern. These are articles about the 55S, which also had something called a multi-impedance, which means now you can actually extend the wire of the microphone. And by the way, before I talk about as well the polar pattern again, changes. I'm going to talk about the impedance changes. And what do I mean by impedance is that the lower the impedance of the microphone, the longer the cable can be extended. So previously they were connecting the microphones without a transformer. So inside the mic, there was no transformer. And the length of the cable should have been maximum about 5 to 10 feet. But anything longer than this, you get a loss in the signal, or the sound starts to get a bit dark. So adding a transformer enabled the user to get longer cable. And when I say longer cables, like way longer cables, like maybe up to 200, 300, 400 feet, can be even up to 700 feet. And that is significantly longer versus the 10, 5 to 10 feet. The change in the polar pattern after that was the supercardioid. And when I say supercardioid, it doesn't mean better cardioid, or doesn't mean a supercharged cardioid. And a lot of people ask me this question: hey Barry, what is better, a cardioid or a supercardioid? I mean, isn't the supercardioid better? It's like, that is a wrong answer. It doesn't mean super meaning it's better or worse. It's a name that they called it just to distinguish it from the cardioid. Now, what makes a supercardioid completely different than the cardioid? There's only one commonality here between the cardioid and the supercardioid, is that the front sensitivity is the highest. And the supercardioid actually adds a bit more, extra on the front in terms of gain before feedback. But the most important part about the supercardioid is that it has 2 rejection points. And when I say 2 rejection points, this one has a single rejection point, which is at the back of the microphone. And the supercardioid in that case has 2 rejection points. These 2 rejection points are close to the side of the microphone. They are not on the back anymore. Now, how does that help? It actually helps quite a lot when you have a band on stage. So I'm going to plug in a microphone right now. It's a supercardioid, Beta 58. Everybody knows that microphone. So we're going to check how it corresponds to the audio. So now the sound is from the handheld microphone. I think it's pretty loud. You can hear it. So when I talk on the front, it works perfectly and sound is clear. But look what happens when I turn the mic to the side. When I turn it to the side, you can see that the sound is pretty much gone, like diminished a lot. But when I talk from the back, you hear a little bit of the low frequency. Might not be clear in the webinar, but if I'm connecting it to a PA, you would hear the low frequency pretty well. So now when I go back again to the front, you can hear it like quite well. So in comparison with an SM58, which I'll do right now, so this is a cardioid microphone, and going to the side, you can still hear a decent amount of audio compared to the supercardioid. But from the back, it's pretty dead. You might not even hear me anymore. Check 1, 2. 1, 2, check. Yep. Now, the good thing about supercardioids in terms of applications is that it helps a lot eliminating leaks or unwanted leaks. A good example would be when I have a saxophone player next to a trumpet player, next to a guitar player. And the stage is pretty much, in a bar or in a small venue where you don't have a lot of spacing. And that also you have a ceiling which is kind of also not quite high. The biggest issue that most of the engineers face is that when they use a cardioid microphone. So yes, for example, a SM57 is a perfect instrument microphone, works perfect with the saxophones, with guitars, and works perfectly also with the trumpets. But knowing the fact that the cardioid can pick up the sound from the side, yes, slightly lower than the top, but it still does pick the sound from the side. What happens is that with a loud source, it can be easily leaking to the other microphone. And what happens is, if that source is really loud and you want to reduce it on your mixer, but the other source is not as loud. So let's talk about, for example, a saxophone who's playing, just at the normal volume, and then next to it you have a solo trumpet player. Now the solo trumpet player is quite loud in your PA, you want to reduce it, but the saxophone is not. What happens is that the saxophone microphone is picking up the trumpet either or. So, not either as in addition to his current microphone. And even if you kill his microphone, you still pick up the leaks coming into the saxophone. And that doesn't sound good anymore. So what happens is that you need to add another measure of rejection, which is rejection from the size of the microphone. And that's where the supercardioid becomes very helpful. So you can see that the kind of application is where it is making the difference. Okay. Now, the development of the Unidyne, we're still talking about the Unidyne, which is the unidirectional dynamic microphone, summed in one word, the Unidyne microphone. So Unidyne 2 was the supercardioid, which we still have them today under the name of the Super 55, the one with the blue grill on the front. So the 55S is the basic Unidyne without a transformer. The Unidyne 2 is the supercardioid, which is the Unidyne 2 version of it, which is in the same packaging, looks the same like a classic microphone that people like to call it, but it actually has a blue grill. Some special editions of those were made. Probably people who know Metallica, they have the black on red. So it's a black metal with a red grill. That was a special edition made at that time. And there was a reissue of another special edition. We called it the Black Super 55, which comes a black grill with a black finish of the microphone. I think still some of those are still available in the market. So for those who'd like to get those microphones to keep them as, a memory or something like this, by all means, you go for it. The next version of that was the 545 and the 565. A lot of the people who've seen Freddie Mercury, Bohemian Rhapsody, he was using these versions of the microphones. It's a silver handle that looks like an SM58 and an SM57, but in silver or in chrome. This is where the shock absorber of the microphones was introduced, or the shock mount. When I say the shock mount, I can quickly talk about it here, and I hope it's visible on the camera. You can see here that the cartridge here is kind of not completely mounted. And if I try to kind of press it, you can see that it's able to be pressed. In some other microphones, it's actually way more enhanced. So I can show you the KSM9 version of it. You can see here, you can see that I can actually, it's quite flexible here. So the microphone is not completely mounted on the microphone. The cartridge is not completely mounted on the microphone. So that means it's kind of suspended. And this is where it was introduced in the Unidyne 3. This is where the shock mount was added. And the reason why is that by that time, first of all, the microphone started to get that shape, the handheld shape. Before that, all the microphones looked like this. It looked like a table mount, or it looked like what we call it, the classical shape of the microphones. But the reason they did that upgrade, or did that new shape of the microphone, that people take for granted that the microphone should look like this, just like we talked about last week, is that the artists want to break free from having a stationed microphone. There's more acts happening on stage. So everybody remembers Bobby Brown, and it's quite obvious that he brought in the dance and the stage act pretty well, that everybody else copied him. afterwards that got influenced by him, just like Michael Jackson. So the need of having a smaller microphone that does the same work was required. But that means the motion on the microphone and then the handling and the running on stage needs to be isolated from the microphone. And this is where the shock mount was introduced. And that was in the Unidyne 3. And here we can see them, the 545 and 565. So the 545 is the early version of the SM58 that we know today. And the 565 is the early version of the SM57. The major differences between these two microphones and what we have today is the impedance selection. So you can select the impedance with the switch. So the switch on them is not really a on-off switch. They were an impedance selection switch that time. Later on, the development of the on-off switch was out. And the reason why we have the on-off switch in many applications today is for a guy who's doing a talkback or a guy who's just doing an announcement. So instead of reaching out to the mixer, changing the selection on the mixer or muting or unmuting the channels, you just on the microphone, use it, do your announcement, off again. Or for a lot of the front of house engineers, it's their bread and butter. They always have the mic on the side of the mixer. If I need to communicate with the band on stage for any reason, I pick up the mic, switch it on, say whatever I need, and switch it off again. I don't need to flip pages on my mixer and find that channel to unmute and then talk to the band. These are other shapes of the 545 Unidyne 3. So it came with different mounts. You can see that the tabletop mount, the same mount that is with the Super 55 or 55S, the flexible mount of the microphones. All these versions were available back in the days. Most of them are discontinued, but there are still other versions of the 545. There was an early version for the, some of those were carried over to the SM57 as well. It was quite used in the presidential kit. A lot of the old movies would have these microphones in. Even the reissue of the old movies are kind of slipped out of that title. There was a movie about the Cold War time and the espionage happening that time. And from the beginning of the movie until the end of the movie, all these microphones were showing in that movie. Now, moving forward, the enhancements in the response of the microphone also were introduced. So Shure were the first also to add enhancements on the frequency response. Now, when I say frequency response in the microphone, we initially talked about the bandwidth on how much the microphone can pass through in a bandwidth. So the carbon composite was limited between 400 or 200 hertz to 4 kilohertz. But then with the birth of the dynamic microphone or the cardioid microphone that Shure invented, the bandwidth suddenly became way wider. We started talking about 60 hertz to up to 16 or even 18 kilohertz. That is completely like a day and night. It's like the switch between a monochrome TV and a color TV. Now, when I say that switch, it doesn't mean it's a full HD, but it's a massive switch. But later on, in addition to this, we started adding emphasis, or we started to add some coloration on the microphone. It's not drastic, it's not massive, but a human voice got a lot of complexity tones into it. The most important tones in the communication that people really need to get the clarity in a microphone is in the high frequency. Now, an example would be if I try to cover the microphone. Last week I did something like this, or if I try to cover my face. So if I start talking like this, then not all the letters sound the same. Some S's sound like F. So I say star and far. They star and far versus star and far. Kind of the S and the F creates the same kind of noise on the microphone. So if the microphone bandwidth is limited, like a carbon composite, like the phone line, even to a very close date to now, I think in 2009, 2008, before the 3G was in, we were like, we noticed the big change in the sound over the phone. If somebody goes into a slightly less coverage, you start to feel the change in the tonality on the phone. So the requirements for phonetics back in the days was actually to elaborate on those. So when I say stone or phone, I need to say what's the first letter. So I say S for sugar or Sierra, or say F for fox, and that makes a difference. Now, in the 545 or Unidyne 3, the emphasis on the frequencies added in, which is we need less bass on the vocal mic, but we need more treble on the vocal mic. So we added an enhancement, as you can see in the graph, that there is a kind of enhancement from about 2 kilohertz up to 8 kilohertz, which is about around 3 decibels, 2 to 3 decibels boost on treble. That makes the vocal mic a vocal mic. So today when I say it's a vocal mic, automatically I understand that it has the vocal enhancements on the microphone to make it clearer for vocals. Now, going into the next slide. Just need to switch off something. Okay. Okay. Now, when I talked about the reversions, here we can see the reversioning of them. So this is the birth of the early SM58 and SM57s. They were still kind of taking some of the mounting characteristics that they had in the 545 and 565, which were the mounting on the pole, just like now here, or getting the clip that became afterwards. Let me see if I have one here. Yeah, that's a clip. That kind of clip. So that was introduced in the SM57 and SM58. So before that, the clip was not existent. We were still using the screw mount, as in using the same body of the microphone to be screwed on the microphone stand. So introducing the clip afterwards, that made also a huge difference. Now the microphone became smaller, which is that form factor. So this shows some of the components, which are the shock mount, the transformer inside the microphone as well that changes the impedance. Also, by the way, the transformer can kind of dictate the frequency response of the microphone. In physics, generally, coils, they absorb a lot of the low end, while when the low end is absorbed, it leaves more room for the higher frequencies. So the transformer, which we find in most of the microphones built by Shure, you can see it down here. So I'll just put it close to the camera. You see that yellow thing submerged in the plastic? So this is the transformer that is doing the job. And by the way, the chamber here behind the microphone also comes into calculation. It plays a big role in dictating the frequency response of the microphone. So the amount of air trapped behind the microphone also contributes in the way the microphone behaves. I'm going to talk about more of those details in the next episodes in our webinars. Of course, later on, more versions came out. So then we had the beta series and we had the PG series, and now we have them as a PG Alta series, and they all founded on the same principles, or the working principles of the early 1939 days of the microphones, which was initiated by Shure. I like to take this picture here, which is showing the complexity of choosing a microphone today. It's almost the same way of choosing a car. we see plenty of cars, and every manufacturer has all the range of cars from, you know, the smallest going up to the highest, and so on and so forth. It's that if I want to choose one of those, it's very hard. The variation of colors is a lot. The difference in specs is a lot. But the same thing is in microphones today. Like, if it's only for vocals, it makes it simple. Just talk about vocal microphone. Most of the microphones can work for vocals. But, you know, just as an example, this omnidirectional microphone that I was choosing at the beginning, this is a broadcast microphone. Now, yes, it can work as a vocal microphone, but I would shoot myself in the foot if I use it on stage. The reason why is that the presenter in a video scenario where you have a camera and you have a person that you're interviewing, you don't want to put the microphone as close as possible to his nose or to his mouth, because it doesn't feel comfortable to the person that you're interviewing. It kind of makes them kind of lean backwards, or kind of it becomes very uncomfortable. So you can see in some of the early movies, especially in the 70s, that the presenter is holding the microphone down here and he's talking. Now, the reason why he does this way, because the mic is an omnidirectional. It doesn't get affected by proximity effect. And when I say proximity effect, that means when I get closer to the mic, there's a change in the volume and in the frequency response. And when I step away from the microphone, there's a change in the frequency response as well. And there's a change in the volume. But omnidirectional microphone does not show that as an effect. So this is a special purpose microphone. So comparing it to an SM58, the results might sound the same in a closed environment like this. But when I'm doing an interview, you'd like to hold the microphone as far as possible from the frame. So when the microphone is down here and I'm talking, it works. But if I'm a singer, it's a completely different ballgame. Now, quality is more important here. I need to hear all details because I'm performing here. It's not about sending a message only, it's about performance. So that means then the microphone has to be within a certain proximity. Now, of course, there are more dedicated microphones that can combat this. An example would be a KSM8, for example, here. This is one of the latest microphones. We'll talk about this in details. This is the wireless version of it. This is a microphone with 2 diaphragms, which actually manipulates or plays around the game with polar patterns. Now, how does that game, or how does that be manipulated? Simply, we just mentioned that the omnidirectional microphone does not exhibit issues with proximity. Now, also, certain frequencies behave in a different polar pattern. That means a lower frequency register does not behave the same way as a high frequency register. So an example would be, this microphone here is picking the sound from me. It's aimed to me and it's a cardioid microphone. So if I turn the microphone slightly off, so let me put the microphone slightly off. The first thing that you lose is the high frequency. High frequency becomes less, but the low frequency is kind of still there. But when I aim it to me, the most important part becomes the high frequency. So that means lower frequency are less directional than high frequencies. And if you try to kind of remember, if you have a home theater at home, if you have a subwoofer in your home theater, doesn't matter where you put it, you find manuals, they put them in the top right corner, or in the back right corner, or in the center, or in the far left corner. It doesn't make a difference because base frequencies are omnidirectional. Now the KSM8 plays around that behavior. So KSM8 acts omnidirectional to low frequencies, in which the low frequencies are not affecting the microphone by adding a boost on it, like the standard cardioid microphones, where low frequencies kind of add or become louder on the source or on the microphone. But to the rest of the spectrum, it's still a cardioid microphone. But we're going to go into that in more details in one of the episodes when we talk about these microphones. Of course, we're going to have a portion for questions in the next 10 minutes, so just stand by so we can have a Q&A answer. For me, this kind of covers most of the famous polar patterns. Of course, there are more polar patterns that exist in the market than the ones we explained today, but these are the most used polar patterns, which are the omni, cardioid, and supercardioid. Now, of course, there are more which are used in broadcast. So an example would be a shotgun microphone, which is a very long microphone. They call that lober. It's based on something called hypercardioid. So we have some microphones with hypercardioid. This is one of them. A subcardioid, which is similar to omni with a slight amount of rejection from the back, only on high frequencies, which eliminates a lot of the noise from the ambience, but it still acts mostly like an omnidirectional. We have also a half cardioid, which is existing in boundary microphones. So microphones that are on the tabletop, like a flat tabletop kind of microphones. These are called half cardioid. And then you have a new polar pattern that Shure invented that is called a toroidal, or you can call it a donut, which means that it rejects the sound from the center of the donut, just like the donut has a hole. So from that center here, it does not pick up anything, but it picks up anything from around. So if I have a tabletop microphone, it will pick up the speakers around it, but it will not pick up the fan noise or the AC noise from the top. I'd like to open the mic in the last 10 minutes here or so to my colleague Fali to kind of elaborate on the part related to choosing polar patterns in certain environments. So either in studio or in live. So Fali,
yeah, hey
are
Barry.
you here?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, I'm here. Can you guys hear me? All good? Lovely.
Yes.
I just want to let everyone know that we're also before we get into that that on the right hand side of your screen there should be a Q&A button. So if you guys want to add questions, then you can start typing them out down there. And also we're running some polls. There'll be an icon right next to that. So a small yes and no kind of polls. All right, Barry. Choosing microphones in a live scenario, yeah?
Could be live also or in studio. So I know that you did a lot of studio sessions with A.R. Rahman. And I know when you try to choose a microphone to, for example, mic up a guitar amp, or you want to mic up a drum kit, want to mic up an ethnic instrument, you take in considerations the directivity of the sound and the nature of the sound that you're recording, correct?
Yep, absolutely.
Yes,
And you take into account a lot of things, firstly, with respect, let's talk about studio first, with respect
Yep.
to the room. In the case of like a drum set, the primary thing would be where is the drum set placed in the room, what the walls are doing, what kind of reflections is the room creating. And you choose your microphones based on these various factors. Sure, you can, grab whatever you have on a wall and throw it on the drum kit and to an extent hope for the best. But the right selection of the mics, specifically the mics that you use for overheads and the mics that you use for room mics. Very, very important to be careful about selection of these microphones. Now, for example, there is a room, in fact, in Mumbai, a very, very famous studio. And it's an extremely live, tiled room. That's the sound they went for. In that kind of a room, I remember the first time we visited there, we experimented with, cardioid microphones for the room. And just as a, last minute thing, we were like, oh, let's just, choose, they had a pair of bidirectionals there. Like, let's just use bidirectional so we capture from the front and capture from, what's happening at the back. And the difference was difficult to put into words. Because suddenly it's almost like you listen to the drums, basically, like, let's say, just facing the drums. and now it almost seems like you're in the drum room where the drum is being played. So it's that kind of a drastic effect that you can have when you switch sometimes from cardioid to bidirectional or to omnis. And most often you'll find in specifically for drums, percussion, chorus sections, violin sections, string sections for that matter, they're always using bidirectional, and in some cases they're using omni because they want to capture the string section. They also want to capture what the room is doing.
So the ambience, picking up the ambient sound was something that.
No question about that. Yeah. Because it's like yeah, you can have a tiny mic that's 1 inch away from what you want to pick up, but you have to think about it in a way that you're never going to listen to that instrument from 1 inch away. You're always listening to the instrument from maybe a few feet away. Typically, when you use room mics, what you're doing is, yes, you want to capture the instrument, but you also want to capture what the room is doing. And some of the most, if you go back in history, some of the most famous drum recordings, right from the days of, I'd say, Bryan Adams to Aerosmith to Guns N' Roses, those were all done in reasonably big-sized drum rooms. And a lot of them were done with bidirectional, and the room mics were bidirectional, and the room mics were omni.
That is true. That is true. Yes.
Yeah.
I think one of the perfect examples of the figure 8 or the bidirectional microphones that we have are the KSM 313 and the 353. Also, we have some capsules that comes on the Beta 181 that has the figure 8. Sorry, of course, I missed that one because I didn't have it in front of me and I was not reminded about the figure 8. But just a quick explanation on what the figure 8 is that imagine if you have two SM58s kind of, or two actually Beta 58s, just back to back, one picking up from that side, one picking up from that side. And from the middle here, it's like no pickup at all. So the polar pattern looks like a number 8. They call that a figure 8 or a bidirectional. And that means the mic is picking up from the front and also picking up from the back, whatever the room sounds like. So sorry for missing that out. Yeah, keep going. Sorry.
Yeah, and when we come to live, and especially when we come to most instruments, drums and singers especially, you have to be very careful when choosing a microphone with the right polar pattern. And two reasons for that. Number one is if you have an artist that uses mostly stage monitors, you need to be very careful of where those stage monitors are placed. So if I'm using, let's say, an SM58, which is a cardioid polar pattern, yes, I can have the wedges right in front of the artist. Now, if I, on a certain day, switch to a Beta 58, now that might start creating a problem because the Beta 58 is a supercardioid pattern. So now if I have those wedges in the same place, I'm actually picking up the wedge sound from the back of the microphone. So that means your gain before feedback now suddenly comes way down. The solution for that would be to actually shift the wedges off to the sides where it's in the rejection zone of the Beta 58. So that's, something like that is very, very important to know about the microphones. Yes, first thing is we gravitate towards what they sound like, but I think something more important and what will dictate where you use the mic is the polar pattern. It's very, very important, I feel, to read polar patterns, or at least to have a look at the polar pattern from the manual. And as far as very true. As far as drums go, again, it's very often you find, or at least I find, kind of supercardioid microphones being used on something like a snare drum, and then we wonder like, why am I hearing suddenly so much hi-hats through the snare drum mic? But that's again is the wrong mic for the wrong application. You need to be careful about stuff like this. We generally go cardioid most often, and at the moment most of our gigs are on in-ear monitors. So um, um, as long as we are cardioid, it's a nice safe pattern to go with. There are some singers that I work with that are exceptional singers, and for them we do go super cardioid because they are very singing technique wise, they are very strong. So I'm not worried about the mic going off axis and losing sound, etc. So
Nice.
from that point
So
of view, it's quite safe. Yeah.
So a question here: if I'm getting leaks on my snare from the hi-hat, and I think since the hi-hat is next to the snare, let me put a super cardioid here, and so I can actually limit the sound from the sides.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
how does that help usually? I mean, versus using just a
No,
cardioid.
yeah, you could actually move the supercardioid slightly out of the way so that the hats actually fall into the rejection zone of the microphone. So
Yes.
that's a trick you can try by actually getting the drummer to play hats, and getting someone to move that microphone until you hear the least amount of hats, and that would probably be the place to go as far as that mic goes. It's a lot of it is like, I'm not saying that you won't pick up tons of hats even using a cardioid. Yes, you will if that mic is placed incorrectly.
Sure.
So if you're using microphones, and I think even for live, just like you do in a studio, very important to move the microphones around until you get to an extent, get the sound that you're going for.
Nice.
Fix it now rather than fixing it in the mix, basically.
Exactly. So speaking about let's say studio environments generally, how many times you had issues in people sending you recordings or asking you? Of course, everybody wants to ask an expert. So somebody calls you on the phone, is like, Fali, can you hear my mix, or can you help me with my draft recording, which I'm having issues with? And you realize there's lots of bleeds. And sometimes you ask people to send you pictures. Like, can you send me a picture of how your microphone placement was? And it actually answers all the questions, correct?
Oh, there's no question about that. And I think one of the reason for that to an extent is the overuse of gates. That people like, we'll just, especially when it comes to again drums, we'll gate it, we'll take care of it. But no. There's some things a gate can do, and there's a lot of things a gate cannot do, which you can achieve by just placing the mic correctly and choosing the right microphone.
That's something I've noticed
yeah.
in some of the placements. Like sometimes when I used to work in the studio or in live, usually before the recording, I take a look on how the microphones were placed. So sometimes you have more than one hands in the place you're working at, and you find somebody who already rigged the microphones for you, and you look at the microphone placement and you go like, no, this is completely not going to work, especially taking into consideration when you have the polar patterns that you're talking about. So you find, for example, a cardioid microphone that is put in a tom, and if you look at the polar pattern from the front, it's actually not going to pick up only the tom. It's going to pick up the tom and the snare because it's pointing towards both of them. While a simple movement, like just a few inches away, like from here just to here, you're actually making the mic point into the tom, and the next thing next to it is the void. There's nothing else down there, or like it's the first piece of the kit. And same thing when it goes with overheads, or when it comes to the other tom or the other part of the drum kit. So I mean, these things are very important to take in consideration when it comes to polar patterns. But do you have any stories that you can mention, like from your experience about things like that?
It's way common. And it's very common when you've gone up to stage and you've set up the mics where you want them, and then you come back after the show and realize, oh gosh, the snare mic's not where it's supposed to be, the toms mics are not where they're supposed to be. And, yes, stuff moves around, but I make it a point to have a chat with especially the drummers and the percussionists in the band. Like, this mic is placed here because it's going to do this. And if it moves, you're going to feel that change in your in-ears. I'm going to feel that change outside. So I leave it up to you to move that mic back in place, wherever possible. And if you can't, then call someone from the tech crew from the side of stage to do that for you. But that's all too common. Very, very common.
Nice. I know also in live you use some of the broadcast microphones to capture certain kind of sounds. Is that correct?
We use shotguns to capture again ambience for the in-ear monitors.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Yep, very common. Again, in-ear monitors without ambience sound dead, very lifeless. And it's a good way to bring ambience into the in-ear monitor mix without, flooding it with too much reverb. So
nice.
It's quite a common practice.
Nice. So the sound of the crowds that we hear in live shows, either on YouTube or in a DVD,
Yep,
that is from shotgun microphones, correct?
That's all shot. It's all shotgun, and it's very common, in fact, for people to use. They use shotguns in some places, but it's very common for people to even use SM57s, in fact, for the audience that's right in front of the stage. Yes, because 57s are a little more forgiving. Shotguns tend to pick up. The pattern of a shotgun is quite often too narrow. So they use 57s for the front row, and they have shotguns like, up top where they can actually pick up a wider section of the audience. So I've seen 57s, 58s, a whole bunch of shotguns being used as well and sometimes audience microphones, they'll go up to 20, maybe 30 microphones.
Nice. Lovely.
Yeah.
And speaking of the omnidirectional microphones, where were there situations where you found the omnidirectional microphone quite useful? I mean, we know in broadcast it's always there because they don't want to create the proximity. But also certain instruments do respond really nicely to omnidirectional microphones, correct?
I'd love to use a few more omnidirectional microphones in my live gig. It's just that, like you mentioned in your presentation, that most often gain before feedback can be a problem. So I need to pick and choose where specifically I'm going to use an Omni mic. So if it tends to be something like Indian classical, which is not too loud, and they don't want crazy loud levels on their monitors, then Omnis will work really, really well. Especially I find them for kind of stringed instruments, they work quite well. But I think it just dictates the situation, the instrument, the venue sometimes just dictates to an extent what mic we end up choosing. I've known omnidirectional lavs to be used on violins, in fact. Quite common to use, omnidirectional lavs on violins,
Nice. How do you translate that omnidirectional microphones for violins or for double bass or for string instruments work better than cardioid? I mean, what is that thing that they do that makes those instruments sound better with Omni?
Yeah, it's just that Omnis sound more real. It sounds like the instrument and doesn't sound like, you have your one ear 2 inches away from the instrument. So you get the instrument, yes, but you also get a little bit of slight bit of ambience, which is very important. But then again, that being said, it's you have to be careful about where you use Omnis.
Nice. Well, that explains actually in some of these string instruments that it has something called a sound post. So the sound post is a piece of wood, like a pencil kind of thing, or a bit longer, that is stretched between the front side of the instrument and the back side. So apparently, when I read about the sound post, it says that the double bass or the cellos or even the violins, they emit the sound from the front and the back of side of the instrument. So just like Fally said, if you just mic the instrument with a cardioid, let's say if this is a cardioid mic, and I mic the top of the violin, you're only getting the sound of the top, where 50% of the sound of the violin is actually coming from the back, and then the
Yeah.
reflections around it. So
Yeah.
probably using an omnidirectional microphone with these instruments
Yeah.
just brings out the life of
Yeah.
these instruments out.
Yeah. You know
Yeah,
what?
that
Where,
is,
in fact, there's one thing that I forgot, which I should have mentioned, is, all the hollow body acoustic guitars that have,
yes,
some of them have piezo, some of them have microphones, and those microphones that are in that guitar are by default always Omni. And
nice.
that's why you will also find that when you use those guitars and you don't high pass a little bit, you can start to get a little feedback in the low area. But yeah, acoustic guitar, the mics built into most acoustic guitars are Omni.
Nice, nice. Well, thank you very much, Fally, for sharing your experience. It's always nice to hear from you. And
You're most welcome, mate. Always a pleasure listening to your presentations.
thank you very much.
Thank
I
you very
think
much
we
for
are,
having me.
thank you. Thank you. So we are getting close towards the Q&A part right now. And I'd like to see some of those questions. Of course, you can address these questions to both of us, me and Fally, and we will be more than happy to answer those. So all you need to do is just tag the name there. Fally, you are always welcome to also to kind of jump in at any time.
Oh, thank you.
So let me start with the first question. It says, which mic model is recommended for a choir? That is a very nice question, actually. So you remember the part when I talked about the enhancements and the frequency response on the microphones, for example, like an SM58. So it has an enhancement of the high frequency and it has a bit of a cut on the low frequency. Because as a speaker, as a vocalist myself, this is what defines my voice. But when it comes to choirs, this is where the whole sound signature changes completely. The choir sounds like a choir because of the group. And this is where everything kind of changes its form. So this is how you want to pick it up as it is. So the way you hear it, you want to pick it up like exactly how you hear it. And the choirs also is quite wide because you have sometimes, it could be as small as 5 or 4, but can be as big as 50 or 70. So what happens here, you start to think more in like an interior designer. How can I make the sound of that view? So there are multiple ways to do it. You can do it with a single microphone, you can do it with 2 microphones, and then you can do it with even 4 microphones. But the easiest and the most straightforward way to do it is by using 2 microphones with a flat frequency response, and they are quite sensitive. So usually we use pencil microphones. This is one of them here. This is an SM81. So a pair of those, one on the right side or the middle part of the right side, one in the middle part of the left side, aimed towards the choir, and then you'll be able to capture a stereo image of these of the performance. If you're mixing in mono, then you can either mix down these two in one channel or on both center, or you just use one of those with a slightly higher gain in the middle and you pick up the whole choir. Sometimes you wanna segregate your choir in altos and sopranos. This is where it starts to get a bit more complicated. So then you start using more than 1 microphone, more than 2 microphones. So you do a far left, center, and right, or far left, mid right, far right, and you pan them accordingly. And also you need to level them. But the key point to this, and I think Fally here can also kind of jump in and approve this point here, that if it doesn't sound in your ears or in your cans the same way it sounds on stage, that means you need to do something more. Fally, how do you do choirs in general?
Um, this is a very good question and quite a tricky subject. We have, in fact, I just spoke to someone a few days ago. They're from the northeast of India that have a lot of churches and houses of worship, and they love the KSM 137s. Love them, love them, love them. For They use 4 of those to mic a choir of about 20 people. And
Nice.
yep. And I was like, what about, I asked them, what about gain before feedback? It's like, no, I mean, it just works perfectly for us. Couple of things. Yeah, you'll need to, it's a good thing to always walk out, listen to what the source sounds like, and then listen to it on your headphones after it's been mic'd and try and get reasonably close to the source. So which means you might have to play around with a little phase, you might have to play around with moving the mics, you might have to play around with a slight bit of EQ, but whatever you need to do to get the job done. Yeah.
Nice.
I've personally
Nice.
never worked with a large choir before, but this is just from an experience of one of our clients down here.
Nice. Thank you very much. So, second question here, we see, I once had a great engineer not use dynamic on drums at all. I found that to be rather unorthodox. Okay, at the time. Sorry, the text is in gray and I find it a bit hard to read. He spent a little time on stage changing mics, positions, then sound check the band, and I have to say that I was very impressed at that he was able to achieve. So he's saying that he didn't use that he used condenser microphones on stage. So I get from this question that you mean that would I use condenser mics or dynamic mics on stage? That is a very good question, and the answer has 2 parts. Part number 1 was maybe back in the days they were not using condenser microphones a lot on stage for many reasons. Reason number 1, they're extremely sensitive, they're bulky, they required external preamps, and due to their sensitivity and the kind of a growing experience of the engineers that time, they were not able to accommodate or to able to control these microphones on stage. Now, today's condenser microphones are completely different than the condenser microphones back in the days. The most important part about the condenser microphone today is that it's able to handle high SPLs. And that in my opinion, one of the game changers that was happening in the condenser microphone industry. You can find a lot of the microphones that has a attenuation switch, like the SM81 here has a disc on the top that you can rotate, which adds a minus 10 decibels attenuation. This itself actually gives you a lot of room in dynamics. The other thing is the high pass filter, the possibility to eliminate a lot of the low frequencies that you don't want the condenser microphone to pick up. So what you say is very true, by the way. Shure manufactures the Beta 98 series, the 98 and the 98 AMP with the Beta 181. We have, of course, the SM81, which is a very famous overhead and hi-hat microphone. The KSM 137. All of these are actually very famous high-end studio grade and live condenser microphones. So yes, you get a lot of results with these for one simple reason, is that you have more gain before feedback. So that means you don't need to make your preamps very sensitive to get the whole dynamic range of your drum kit. And that is where you dictate a lot of the feedback issues and the leakage issues. A lot of the engineers, unfortunately, they like to go for the easy way out. So if the source is not enough, they just gain it up. And usually this is something I start to do when I have no choice at all. And I need to kind of find that balance of, that thin line of maximum gain I can get before I get feedback. But in many situations where I have, let's say, a vocalist, and in some situations you find that the vocalist is not producing enough, is not projecting his voice enough, and that is quite common. So the first thing I try to do is I go to the vocalist and I speak to him is like, I need you to put in more effort. And a lot of the vocalists in the sound checks, usually they don't do that. Or a lot of the vocalists, when they sound check on the wrong phrasing. So he picks up the mic and it goes like, hey, hey, 1, 2, 1, 2, check, 1, 2, hey, hey. And he start asking the engineer, can I have more in my wedge? Hey, hey, 1, 2, 1, 2. And then during this performance, he start like pushing his vocals. And of course you get feedback because the monitor is pushing way louder than the hey, hey, hello, hello, 1, 2. So when I have a vocalist on stage, the first thing I ask him is like, can you just perform, sing? Because if he's gonna do his vocals based on, you know, a check like a quick hey, hey, and hello, this is not what actually is gonna. It's not actually what I'm tuning his mic for. I'm tuning his mic for singing. If he's gonna talk, and he's doing it lower than I need or than the microphone requires, then I speak to him. It's like, I need you to project your voice. And that is one of the big misconceptions about microphones, is like the mic does not collect the voice. It does not it's not like a vacuum cleaner where it sucks the voice in. If I speak quietly, the mic is not going to pick up anything. An example will be now, if I speak like this, 1, 2, 3, ladies and gentlemen, check, hey, 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 1, 2. And the biggest issue with microphones is when you give monitoring pre to the time that this person is on stage. So a lot of people try to kind of save the time. They have a very small slot in sound checking, and they start putting the levels on the monitor before the performer's on stage. And they put the level quite to a level that they are sure that the guy is not going to ask him for more anymore. But some people are not used to this. So what happens is that when he goes on stage and it's loud because nobody else is playing on stage, he backs up his vocals. So he starts performing less. And suddenly when the band is kicking in, your levels are not right. Now, the same thing with drums. I sound checked with many drummers who you ask him to do the kick and it goes like with his foot, like tap, 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 tap. And then his leg gets lazy and he starts, barely touching the drum kit. And I go like, no, you need to hit it like you're hitting it, like you're playing. Same thing with the snare. He goes like, slight wrist movement. I was like, no, you need to, rip it like you're playing the snare. And this also helps you dictating how you want to go with it. But we'll go a lot about these details, by the way, in our next webinars, because we're going to go into some miking sessions. And this is where you're going to learn more about the extreme edges of the mics and how they can go for this. But to have a short answer to you, there is nothing wrong in using condenser microphones on drum kits. Actually, you get more details as long as you know what is your gain structure. And gain structure itself, as a title, has a separate training for that. We're going to talk about this in full details. So I hope that answered the question. So somebody's asking why the SM7B is legendary, Mike, and which instrument can be used for it. That is a very nice question, by the way. Honestly, this is an SM7B.
Wait, there's one more question right at the top, the very first question, and there's a person that wants to know why the mic you are using right now sounds much clearer than an SM58.
Okay, I'll hit two birds with one stone. So the reason why is there's two reasons to this. Number one, the SM7B is a flat response microphone, and it's a dynamic microphone. So when it's a dynamic microphone, that means it's not very sensitive, so it can accommodate a lot of the room issues. So my room here is quite well in terms of acoustics. It's tight. Now, is it tight enough or not? In my opinion, it's not tight enough to be considered like a take room or like a vocal booth. Behind me is a vocal booth, and if I go inside there, it's dead silent. If I want to measure it with an SPL meter, it's about 35 decibels. While here, if I turn on the AC, it's about 52 to 55. With the AC off, it's about 45 decibels. Now, SM7B is known to be able to accommodate that. The other thing with it, which makes the SM7B quite famous as a microphone, it's one of the very few general purpose microphones. It sounds good anywhere you use it. Believe it or not, you can use it on a kick. You can use it for bass cabs. You find it on every drop-down list of microphones for guitars. So you can use it to pick up a guitar cab. It works perfect as a room ambience microphone. It's the famous news anchor or radio anchor microphone. Most of the podcasters would use this microphone. Michael Jackson, in his Thriller album, he used this microphone. And I think this is one of the major impacts that made this microphone even go the extra mile in most of the recordings. Anytime you need a vocalist who has a wide dynamic range, probably Fally would speak more about this as well, in a genre in metal which is called death metal, if anybody knows that genre. I'm a fan of it, guilty as seen. That kind of performance where the vocalist is growling. So that means he's pushing a lot of air. If you put a normal condenser microphone, it acts funny. It has a lot of blowing on it. But if you put this microphone, and usually they take the windscreen off, and they put a screen, a popper screen in front of it to kind of become more transparent, because now it's slightly darker with this, but fair enough for vocals. But if you're doing it as a performance where you need more throaty sound, you just take off the windscreen here and you put a popper in the front, and it works perfectly as a dynamic microphone for the studio and for like a very wide dynamic range in vocals. So that is one of the main reasons. Now, why does it sound different to the SM58? I mean, there's many reasons, by the way. Reason number one is that I already tuned my input to work with this microphone. So I did my homework in making it sound good here. The other thing is I was plugging the SM58 generally in a new channel on my desk. I didn't spend a lot of time fiddling with it to check how does it sound. And probably you noticed that there's a very big changes between different microphones that I plugged it in, and that is normal. Some microphones will have a hotter output, some microphones will have a lesser output. The mic that I was using, the black one, I don't know where I placed it, somewhere. Okay, yeah, I placed it here on the table, just cannot see it anymore. That one has a built-in preamp. So yeah, here it is, sorry, that one. So this one here, this is a dynamic microphone, but this is called the VPH handle. It's made for broadcasters. So it has a built-in preamp into it. So this, with any head of the wireless heads, would work as a wired microphone, but this would sound hotter than the standard Beta 58 plugged into the desk because it doesn't have a preamp in here. So these are normal variations that changes the tonality of the microphones. But I strongly recommend everybody to not fall behind this and don't go behind blind tonality, because there's plenty of microphones that has overcoloring on them. And when I say overcoloring, that it's kind of doing a job on your behalf. So you go and you buy an X or Y or Z brand that, you know, for the first glimpse, it sounds nicer on your drum kit. But when you check the frequency response curve, you find it colored. So that means it's sensitive to more frequencies than the others. So that means it's not giving you a very true response of what the source sounds like. So kind of try to know what the frequency response is on the microphone versus a flat response microphone. So the SM7B is a flat response microphone. There are switches on the back here that you can manipulate this. So have less bass, more treble, or just less bass, standard treble, or just standard bass, standard treble, and just like a flat response. And then it becomes an instrument microphone. So it's a very good general purpose microphone. And there's a nice blog written about it with a lot of jokes as well I recommend everybody to look for it. It's called SM57 on steroids dash SM50 SM7B, or just put SM7B dash SM57 on steroids. And there's a long article that could answer all your questions to details about what makes this microphone a legendary microphone. Let me try to move to some other questions. So why the SM7B has a lower output, although it's a dynamic microphone? And does Shure offer the perfect solution for boosting this output? Okay. That is a good question. Now, most important part about this is that the microphone, you can see that it's quite long, okay? Now, guess where the cartridge is? Do you know where? The cartridge is literally almost here. So there's already quite a distance, but that actually plays a big role in the way the microphone behaves as well. Now, lower sensitivity when it comes to microphones actually helps in giving you kind of a wider dynamic range if you can do this. I mean, how many times you use the microphone and somebody, because has a strong vocals, actually clips the microphone, makes the microphone itself distort. Now, that is one of the main reasons why you need good preamps with the SM7B. And that is one of the main reasons that what makes a lot of people actually get disappointed at the first, let's say, 10 minutes of connecting the microphone is that, oh, I'm putting my gain all the way up to the max and I'm still not getting enough juice from the microphone. So this is how the microphone is built, but this is not the only microphone with a low output, by the way. There are plenty of microphones out in the market that has a low output. And it's made also to accommodate room noises. So in many situations, you have people in the studio that are moving. The studio is not completely closed. You have ventilation. If the microphone is sensitive, it's going to pick up all of that. And this is what you don't want. If somebody's doing a session for a couple of hours on the radio, sometimes you have radio shows that goes back to back, like for 4 to 5 hours, especially in a situation when you have, emergency situations, or you have, announcements that's going back to back. If the anchor in the place is having less convenience because of the movement, because the microphone is very sensitive, this is not going to be easy for him. So that means you're going to get a lot of the room noise. A lower sensitivity microphone helps you more with this. So manufacturing-wise, this is one of the reasons. A cloud lifter works well if your preamp is not having enough juice. Most of the I'm starting to lose my voice, if you allow me. Sorry for this. Most of the preamps that is made by Shure equipment, like the Motive MVI or the X2U, or previously back in the days when we had the onboard mixers or the outboard mixers, which are the rack with auto mixers like the SCM 820 or 810. All of those preamps are actually quite well designed to accommodate the gain required for these microphones. So I strongly recommend you pairing them with these preamps if you wish to use them on the go. If you want to do podcasting sessions, you can easily use the MVI. I'm using it down here, actually. This is my MVI. I use it with Instagram. Unfortunately, today I was doing a live stream and I forgot to send the aux back into it. So for those who are watching my Instagram, apologies. We'll try to fix that. And speaking of Instagram, I have a dedicated Instagram for broadcasting numerous news and functions about Shure. It's called Barry_at_Shure, Barry at Shure. You can follow my page and my Instagram page, and I'll do more Q&A sessions once a week. I'll of course do a pre-announcement to this, and it'll be using the same SM7B through an MVI. I hope that answers the question. Moving forward. So what mics work best with strings, orchestras, violins, etc.? I think we already answered that during the last part of the session. Condenser microphones work really well, pencil microphones in specific. KSM 137, the KSM 141. I can add to this that we have a new microphone that is called the Twinplex. This microphone is a dual diaphragm, flat frequency response, amazingly sounding microphone, and it's a miniature lavalier microphone size. I strongly recommend you going online and checking the Twinplex TL47 or TL48. Check this out for these instruments. They sound amazing. I hope that answers the question. Will this be available offline? Yes, there is a recording for these sessions. I'm sure that there will be an email following to this that will send you the link with the recording. So the recording has to go through editing first to take out the hiccups, my lost voice, or anything like this. Make it more kind of streamlined so it'll be more straight to the point. Thank you for that question. Next question will be why the microphone you're using now is much clearer than the SMT8. I think that answers the question. We did do that. Did we miss any questions already?
I think we've got all. That question was right at the top.
Okay. Perfect. So I think that's good. So I think this will conclude for today. Hope you all enjoyed the session. Stay tuned to the next session on Monday, same time. You can reach out to me on my Instagram page, and that would be good. And it also would add more details. I would type in here my email in the Q&A part as an answer to the last question. So here you can reach out to me at kassab_BARAA@shure.com. Yep. So the last question by Anonymous would have an answer with my email. So please reach out to me anytime, anywhere, with any questions, any suggestions that you want me to cover. I will also be more than happy to do that in the next webinars. Thank you, everybody, and hope to see you, everybody, soon. Thank you for coming. Have a good night.